Jimmy, as he did almost every week, entered the shopping center and went straight to his favorite ice cream shop. The sound of people talking, the smell of sweets, and the familiarity of the place always made him relax. When he reached the counter, the server smiled, already knowing his order. "Same as always, Mr. Jimmy?" the young man asked, already grabbing the vanilla and chocolate cup. "That's right, Tom, you know I don't change," Jimmy replied with a smile. While waiting, he looked around. His usual table, near the window, was free. That's where he liked to sit and watch people coming and going. It seemed like a simple routine, but to Jimmy it was special. There he felt a peace he couldn't find in business, big meetings, or even at the fancy parties he often attended. He took his ice cream, thanked the server, and went to sit down. As he calmly mixed the flavors in the cup, he sighed, thinking about how good it was to have moments like this. Suddenly he noticed a new employee, a young woman, wearing a cleaner's uniform, mopping the floor near him. She seemed focused on her work, and Jimmy realized she was new there as he'd never seen her before. "Hello, miss," he said, trying to start a conversation. "I don't think I've seen you around here before. Are you new?" The young woman looked up, a bit surprised by the attention. "Yes, I started this week." "My name's Alice," she replied with a shy smile. Jimmy smiled back, but something about the way she said her name made him feel strange. Something bothered him, and he didn't know what it was. Then, as she passed by again, he noticed her name badge. Alice Campbell. His heart raced for a second. Campbell? That was the surname of Beatrice, his late ex-wife. A wave of memories flooded his mind. He stopped eating and stared at the young woman as if seeing a ghost. She looked so much like his ex-wife. Without realizing it, he caught her attention. "Is everything all right, sir?" Alice asked, noticing Jimmy's fixed stare. "Sorry, it's just, your surname is Campbell, right?" he asked, trying to hide the surprise in his voice. "Yes, sir, Campbell." "Why?" she said, with a curious but simple smile. Jimmy felt a chill down his spine. He tried to pull himself together, but inside his mind was racing with thoughts. How was this possible? This couldn't just be a coincidence. I knew someone with that surname many years ago," he replied, still a bit dazed. "A very special person." Alice smiled, unaware of the impact her words had caused. "It's a pretty common surname, isn't it? Maybe we're related somehow," she joked, going back to her work, not noticing Jimmy's unease. He stayed there, sitting with his ice cream melting, lost in memories of Beatrice. The name, Alice's simple mannerisms. Everything seemed to stir something he thought he had buried in the past. Jimmy tried to focus on his ice cream, but her surname kept echoing in his head. He looked at his vanilla and chocolate cup, mixing it absent-mindedly. Then he heard Alice, as she cleaned the nearby tables, saying something to a colleague. "You know, ice cream is the one sweet you never get tired of. You can eat it today, tomorrow, and the day after, and you'll always want more," Alice said, smiling. Jimmy froze. The air seemed to disappear for a moment. That phrase, exactly that phrase. Beatrice used to say that every time they came to the ice cream shop together. It was like her mantra, something so unique, so special. He felt his heart tighten, his breath growing heavy. "What did you just say?" he asked, turning quickly to Alice, his face pale. She looked at him, not understanding the urgency in his voice. "Oh, I was just talking about ice cream, how you never get tired of eating it, you know." Jimmy almost dropped the ice cream from his hands. That phrase pulled him directly into the past. He needed to understand what was happening, but for now all he could do was sit there staring at Alice, feeling his heart race, pounding uncontrollably. "That phrase, who told you that?" he asked, his voice trembling, trying to stay calm. Alice stopped cleaning and looked at him, realizing that it really affected him. "Oh, it was a very kind woman who used to visit the orphanage where I grew up," she answered in a gentle tone. "I'll never forget her. She always brought sweets for us and was so caring. Her name was Beatrice." It was as if the world around him had stopped. "Beatrice." Jimmy felt his whole body freeze for a moment, his eyes fixed on Alice, trying to piece together this puzzle. "Beatrice?" he repeated, almost whispering, as if wanting to make sure he had heard right. Yes, Beatrice. She used to come by sometimes, bring us sweets, talk to us, and taught me a lot of things. That phrase about ice cream, for example. I always thought it was funny. She used to say ice cream was the one sweet you never get tired of. Alice smiled, remembering the woman who had clearly left a mark on her childhood. Jimmy didn't know what to say. It was like a storm of emotions was taking over him. Beatrice, his Beatrice, and now this young woman, Alice, was talking about her as if she had known her for a long time. But how? What was Beatrice doing at an orphanage? And why had he never known about this? He looked at Alice again, still unable to believe it. And, do you know anything else about this Beatrice? He asked, his voice almost lost amidst all the questions swirling in his mind. Alice shook her head. Not much. She always said she was busy but loved being with us. I remember she always seemed sad even when she smiled. I never knew why. Jimmy stayed silent, but his mind was a mess. Everything was starting to fit together in a way he never imagined. The surname, the phrase, the name Beatrice. Alice, this young cleaner, seemed somehow connected to his wife's past. But how? He felt he had to find out the truth. He couldn't ignore it. The next day, after spending a nearly sleepless night, Jimmy returned to the shopping center. This time, it wasn't for ice cream, but to talk more with Alice. When he saw her cleaning the floor, he approached, trying not to seem too anxious. "Alice, can I ask you another question?" he said in a calm tone, though clearly worried. Alice, unaware of the storm of emotions inside Jimmy, stopped what she was doing and smiled as always. "Of course, sir." "What do you want to know?" Jimmy took a deep breath as if preparing for something important. "You said that this woman, Beatrice, visited the orphanage where you grew up. Do you know anything about her? Where she came from? Why she went there?" Alice thought for a moment, as if trying to piece together her own memories. "Not much, sir. I was very young, so I didn't ask many questions. She would show up sometimes, bring us sweets and talk. She never said much about her life. I just remember she always seemed distant, like she had something heavy on her heart." Alice paused, then continued. "Once I asked why she never stayed long, and she told me she was doing everything she could to protect me." That last phrase hit Jimmy like a punch to the gut. Protect? Protect her from what? He began to remember details from the past he had left behind, especially from the time before Beatrice died. The pieces were still unclear, but he knew there was something bigger here. He needed to investigate more, and the first step would be discovering what Beatrice had been hiding. "Alice, do you have any records from the orphanage? Any clue where this Beatrice might have come from?" he asked, now determined to move forward. Alice was a bit surprised by Jimmy's interest, but she realized he was genuinely concerned. "I think the orphanage must have something. Yes, I don't have anything myself, but they keep records. If you want, I can help you find out more." Jimmy looked at Alice and felt both hope and fear. Hope to understand what was happening, but fear of what he might find along the way. Whatever it was, he knew he couldn't rest until he discovered the truth. As Jimmy spoke with Alice, a thought began to form in his mind. He stayed quiet for a moment, lost in the memories of his life with Beatrice. There was something he had avoided thinking about for many years, something painful that seemed to have been buried in the past. But now, with all these coincidences, he could no longer ignore it. Almost 26 years ago, Jimmy and Beatrice went through a very difficult time in their marriage. He remembered that period clearly. They separated for a short time, something that was never fully explained by her. He began to sweat, the pieces falling into place in a frightening way. What if Beatrice had been pregnant at that time? What if, for some reason he didn't know, she had hidden it from him? With his mind racing, he looked at Alice once again, trying to see if he could spot something familiar in her. The resemblance to Beatrice, her simple manner, even the way she spoke, now seemed to scream in his head. Could it be possible? Could Alice be Beatrice's daughter? He had to know for sure. "Alice, how old are you?" Jimmy asked, trying not to sound desperate. Alice, not really understanding the reason for the question, answered naturally. "I'm 25, sir." The confirmation hit Jimmy like thunder. 25 years, exactly the time since that separation. He felt his stomach churn, his hands sweating, but he tried to stay calm. His suspicions were too strong to ignore. With his heart pounding, he approached her again, this time with a serious and determined expression. "Alice, I need to ask you something important," he began, his voice trembling a bit but steady. Alice, noticing the more serious tone, stopped what she was doing and looked at him with curiosity, but also a hint of concern. "Of course, sir. What is it?" she responded, a bit surprised. Jimmy took a deep breath and tried to find the right words. It was hard because he didn't want to scare her, but there was no way around it. "You told me you grew up in an orphanage, right? But do you know why you were left there? Do you know anything about your parents?" Alice's face changed. She lowered her eyes for a moment, as if it was a memory she preferred not to relive. She stayed silent for a few seconds, but then looked up again, her expression more serious. "I don't know much about them. I was left at the orphanage as a baby. No one ever really explained why. They just told me my mother left me there and never came back to get me." She gave a small sigh, trying to hide the pain that still lingered. Jimmy felt a lump in his throat. Every word Alice spoke seemed to fit with everything he was beginning to understand. The separation from Beatrice, the name, the surname, the phrase, the age, everything pointed to a truth he feared but also needed to face. Alice. Jimmy hesitated, feeling the weight of the words on his tongue. "The woman you met at the orphanage, Beatrice. I think she was my ex-wife, and it might be that—" He swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. "That you are her daughter." Alice froze for a moment, shocked by the revelation. Her eyes widened, and she took a step back, as if trying to process what she had just heard. Your wife?" she asked, her voice weak and filled with uncertainty. "And you think—" "I'm her daughter." Jimmy didn't know how to continue, but he knew there was no turning back now. "I'm not sure, Alice, but everything is connecting. The age, the name, the way you described Beatrice. I need to understand what happened. And maybe you need to too." Alice stood still, trying to process what she had just heard. Her expression shifted from surprise to confusion. "But how? This doesn't make sense," she said, trying to put the pieces together in her mind. Jimmy pushed himself to continue, feeling the weight of each word. "We were married many years ago. She was the love of my life. But 25 years ago we separated because of something that happened. But now, with everything you've told me, your age, the things you remember about her, I think there's a real possibility that you are her daughter, and maybe mine too." Alice was in shock, her face pale as Jimmy's words echoed in her mind. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't seem to come out. The idea that the woman she remembered so fondly could be her mother, and that Jimmy might be her father, was too much to take in. "Me, her daughter," Alice repeated, almost in a whisper, still trying to absorb it all. Jimmy nodded slowly. "I'm not sure yet, Alice, but I can't tell you what happened during that separation unless we're sure you're really my daughter. We need to have that answer first, before anything else." Alice, her heart racing, took a deep breath. She looked at Jimmy, trying to understand how her life had been turned upside down so quickly. But deep down she knew she needed answers too. "And how do we find out for sure?" Alice asked, her voice weak but determined. "We'll figure it out together, I promise." Alice and Jimmy decided they needed answers. They agreed to go together to the orphanage where Alice grew up. The journey was quiet, both lost in their thoughts. Alice was nervous, unsure of what she would find. Jimmy, on the other hand, was restless, eager to understand Beatrice's past and how it all connected to the young woman beside him. When they arrived at the orphanage, they were greeted by an elderly lady who introduced herself as Deborah, the person in charge of the place. "How can I help you?" Deborah asked with a gentle smile. Alice gathered her courage and stepped forward. "I grew up here. My name is Alice Campbell. I'd like to know more about my mother, about why she left me here. The woman who used to visit me, Beatrice, maybe you remember her." Deborah looked at Alice closely, as if trying to recall. "Oh yes, Alice, of course I remember you. You've grown so beautiful, and Beatrice, yes, she used to come here quite often. She was a very sweet woman, always concerned about you," replied the lady with a thoughtful look. "She would bring gifts, ask about you, but she never stayed long." Alice glanced at Jimmy, who encouraged her with a slight nod. She needed to know more. "Do you know why she left me here? Why she never took me back?" Alice asked, trying to hide the pain in her voice. Deborah sighed as if it saddened her too. "Beatrice never told us the reason. She always seemed very sad when she came here, but she never explained why she couldn't take you with her." "I know this must be hard, but I think she had her reasons." Deborah paused before continuing. "What I do know is that she loved you very much. That was clear. She always spoke of you with great affection." Jimmy, who had been silent until then, asked with emotion in his voice. "And she never told anyone anything? No clue about what made her leave her own daughter here?" Deborah shook her head. "Unfortunately, no. She would come, stay for a short time, and leave. It was as if something was stopping her from staying longer, but she never gave us details." Alice, with tears in her eyes, felt the weight of the truth. She had always known her mother loved her, but she never understood why she had been abandoned. Now, with these visits from Beatrice, it only confirmed that there was more to be discovered. Jimmy placed a comforting hand on Alice's shoulder. "We'll find out what happened. I promise we won't stop here." Alice looked at him, and for the first time, she felt she wasn't alone in this search for answers. Deborah looked at Alice and Jimmy with a serious expression, as if she was about to share something important. She hesitated for a moment, but then made a decision. "There's something I think you need to know," said Deborah, her voice a little lower. "Actually, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but I think you, Alice, deserve the truth." Alice tensed up. Jimmy was also on alert, sensing that they were finally about to get some answers. "What do you know?" Alice asked, anxious, trying to keep her emotions in check. Deborah took a deep breath as if she was relieving a burden she had carried for many years. "Beatrice gave me a letter many years ago, just before she stopped coming to the orphanage. She asked me to only give it to you if one day you wanted to know why she left you here. I've kept it as she requested, and I believe it's still in your records." Deborah stood up and went to an old cabinet. She opened a drawer, shuffled through some papers, and pulled out a worn letter carefully folded. She walked back to where Alice and Jimmy were standing and handed the letter to Alice gently, as if she was handing over a piece of the past. Alice took the letter with trembling hands. The paper was aged but still intact. She looked at Jimmy, who nodded encouragingly, urging her to open it. With a deep breath, Alice unfolded the letter and began to read. As her eyes moved over the words written by Beatrice, tears slowly began to fall. She read aloud, her voice breaking. "My dear Alice, I know it must be very hard to understand why I left you at the orphanage. Please believe me, it was the hardest thing I ever had to do, but I did it to protect you. Your biological father, he is a dangerous man. I couldn't let him find you, couldn't let him hurt you. I had to make this decision to ensure your safety. I wanted more than anything to raise you, but the risk was too great. Please forgive me. I will love you forever. Mum." The room fell silent. Beatrice's words hung in the air, heavy, revealing a truth Alice had never imagined. Her biological father. Dangerous. Was that why Beatrice left her at the orphanage? To protect her? Alice felt her heart tighten, torn between sadness and understanding. Jimmy, standing next to her, was visibly shaken. He had never known this. Everything Beatrice had gone through, the reason for their separation, was there in that letter. "She did it to protect me," Alice whispered, trying to absorb the weight of the revelation. Jimmy, his voice low and full of emotion, said, "I'm so sorry you had to go through all of this, Alice. But now we know the truth. We need to find out more about this dangerous man, who he was. And what happened, because our separation was never dangerous. If I were your father, she wouldn't have hidden the pregnancy." Alice wiped away her tears, holding the letter tightly, as if it was the only connection she still had to her mother. "Thank you, Deborah," Alice said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means so much to me." Deborah smiled kindly. "Beatrice loved you very much, Alice. She did what she thought was best." Jimmy looked at Alice, who was still holding the letter in her hands, her eyes filled with tears. He felt a mix of sadness and hope, but more than anything a deep desire to protect her, just as Beatrice had tried to do so many years ago. "Alice," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know everything that happened, but one thing I do know, we're going to find out the truth together. Whoever this man was, whatever he did, I'm here for you. I won't let you face this alone." Alice looked up, her eyes full of tears, but a glimmer of gratitude began to show. She felt the weight of the loneliness she had carried for so many years lift, as if, for the first time, she had someone to share this pain with. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice weak, still trying to control her emotions. "All my life I wondered why my mother left me, why I didn't have a family. And now I find out she did it to protect me and you. You were so close to her. I'd love to accept you as part of my family. Maybe as my stepfather." Those words touched Jimmy deeply. He hadn't expected to hear something like that, but at the same time it meant so much to him. The pain of losing Beatrice was still strong, but now he felt that in some way she had left something very precious. Alice. "Being your stepfather would be an honor, Alice," Jimmy said, his eyes brimming with tears but with a sincere smile on his face. Alice, moved, took a step forward and hugged him. Jimmy returned the hug, holding her gently, as if he was embracing the daughter he never knew he had. In that moment something changed. They were no longer just two strangers connected by a tragedy from the past. They were family now. A few days after their visit to the orphanage, when things were beginning to settle down, Jimmy and Alice were at his house, having coffee and trying to figure out what to do next. Then the doorbell rang. Jimmy, not expecting any visitors, stood up and went to the door. When he opened it, he was met by a man in a suit, holding a briefcase of documents. "Good afternoon. I'm Vincent Hill, a lawyer," the man said formally but politely. "I'm here on behalf of a client who wishes to speak with Miss Alice Campbell." Jimmy, surprised, gestured for the man to come inside. Alice, hearing her name, appeared in the living room, looking confused at the lawyer. "I'm Alice. What's this about?" she asked, unable to hide her curiosity. The lawyer calmly approached, taking some papers out of his briefcase. "I represent someone who claims to be your biological father. He recently discovered your existence and would very much like to meet you." The man looked at Alice, seeing the surprise on her face, and continued, "He is willing to take a DNA test to prove what he's saying, if you agree." Alice felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Her biological father. After so long without any answers, now someone was coming forward wanting to prove he was her father. "But how did he find out about me? Why only now?" Alice asked, her voice weak, unsure of how to react. "My client recently received information about you and believes now is the right time to connect with you," Vincent, the lawyer, replied. "He understands this may be difficult, which is why he wants to conduct the DNA test, so there's no doubt." Jimmy, who was standing next to Alice, watched her carefully. He could see the mix of emotions on her face. This was unexpected, and after everything they had discovered about Beatrice and her past, more questions were arising. "And who is this person?" Jimmy asked firmly, wanting to know more about this man who was likely involved with Beatrice while they were still married. The lawyer paused briefly before answering. "His name is Walter Wilbur. He's a businessman who was involved with Alice's mother in the past. He believes he is her biological father and wants to clear this up once and for all." Alice looked at Jimmy, unsure of what to do. Her whole life she hadn't known who her father was, and now, out of nowhere, someone was showing up wanting to do a DNA test. Doubts, fear, and curiosity swirled in her mind. I don't know what to think," Alice said, almost whispering, lost in the flood of emotions. Jimmy, always calm, placed a hand on Alice's shoulder. "We don't have to decide anything right now. Let's think about it carefully. You have the right to know the truth, but you also have the right to take your time." Alice took a deep breath, and after a moment of silence, she looked at the lawyer. "All right. If he wants to do the DNA test, I agree. I want to know the truth." Alice and Jimmy spent the night thinking about what the lawyer had said. The idea of meeting the man who could be Alice's biological father made both of them anxious, but at the same time, the desire for answers was stronger. The next day, sitting at the breakfast table, Alice looked at Jimmy with uncertainty in her eyes. "I think I need to do this. Meet this man, Walter. Find out what he has to say, understand what happened," Alice said, her voice firm but clearly nervous. Jimmy nodded, understanding how she felt. He knew it was a tough decision, but also an important one for Alice. "If that's what you want, Alice, I'll be with you. You don't have to do this alone," Jimmy responded, with a protective tone. Alice smiled, feeling a bit relieved knowing Jimmy would support her. "Thank you, Jimmy. I really don't know what to expect, but I think I need to know the truth." With that decided, they called the lawyer and arranged a meeting with Walter for the next day at a quiet restaurant in town. On the appointed day, Alice and Jimmy arrived together. Alice was visibly nervous, and Jimmy tried to comfort her, holding her hand firmly. "It'll be all right, we're in this together, okay?" he said, trying to ease the tension. Alice took a deep breath and nodded. They entered the restaurant and at the back saw the lawyer and Walter sitting at a table. Walter, a serious-looking man with graying hair, stood up when he saw them approaching. "Alice, Jimmy, thank you for coming," Walter said, extending his hand. Alice looked at him with curiosity. It was strange to see this man and think he could be her father. But she shook his hand, trying to be polite, despite the storm of emotions inside her. "So, you're the man who believes he's my father?" Alice asked directly, not wanting to beat around the bush. Walter took a deep breath, looking a bit uncomfortable, but answered sincerely. "Yes, Alice, at least that's what I believe. I had a relationship with your mother, Beatrice, many years ago. I only found out about you recently, and that's why I'm here. I want to clear everything up. If the DNA test confirms I'm your father, I would like to—" He hesitated, choosing his words. "Get closer to you in some way." Alice listened, still unsure of what to think. All of this was very new to her, but she wanted to hear the truth. "And why now? Why look for me after all this time?" Alice asked, not hiding her suspicion. Walter lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. I didn't know Beatrice was pregnant. Say if I had known, things would have been different. I only found out about you recently, through an old friend of your mother's. When I found out, I couldn't ignore it. I need to know if you're my daughter." Jimmy, who had been silent until now, looked at Walter and spoke firmly. "We'll do the test. Alice needs to know the truth, but know this, she's not facing this alone." Walter looked at Jimmy and, despite the discomfort, agreed. "I understand. I just want everything to be clear for her and for all of us." Jimmy, always careful, wanted to ensure everything was done properly. After the meeting with Walter, he talked with Alice about how to proceed with the DNA test. "Alice, I know all of this is confusing and hard for you, but I want to make sure there's no doubt about the result," Jimmy said, with a serious look. "We need to ensure the test is done in the safest and most reliable way possible." Alice looked at him, trying to understand what he meant. "What do you mean? What are you thinking?" she asked. "I think to avoid any mistakes or manipulation, we should do the test at 3 different clinics. That way we'll have absolute certainty. This man seems too strange talking about Beatrice in front of me without knowing who I am," Jimmy explained. Alice stayed quiet for a moment, considering the idea. It made sense. If they did the test at only one place, there would always be a doubt in her mind. But 3 different clinics, that would remove any uncertainty. "I think you're right, Jimmy," she said, agreeing with the suggestion. "I don't want any doubts after all this. Let's do it your way." Jimmy smiled, relieved that she agreed. "I'll speak to the lawyer and make sure Walter agrees as well. If he really wants to prove he's your father, he won't have a problem doing it this way." And so it was. Jimmy contacted Walter's lawyer and explained the condition. The DNA test would only be done if it was conducted at 3 different clinics, chosen by Jimmy. Walter's lawyer agreed, and they set the dates for the genetic material to be collected. Alice, though nervous about what the future might bring, felt more secure with Jimmy's plan. "Thank you for thinking of everything, Jimmy. I don't know what I'd do without you here, Alice said, looking at him gratefully. Jimmy gave her a warm smile. You don't have to go through this alone, Alice. We're in this together until the end. Days passed since Alice and Walter did the DNA test at the 3 different clinics. The wait for the results felt endless. Alice was anxious, and Jimmy was always by her side, offering as much support as he could. Finally, the moment arrived. The test results were ready. Alice and Jimmy met with Walter and the lawyer in a private room. The atmosphere was tense. With each passing second, the anxiety grew. The lawyer opened the envelope from each clinic and read the results aloud. The first test negative, the lawyer said firmly. Alice looked at Jimmy, confused, but there were still more tests to be read. The lawyer continued. The second test, also negative. The air felt heavier. Alice was already starting to wonder what was going on, but one test result remained. The lawyer opened the last envelope and looked at the result. The third test came back positive. The room fell silent. Jimmy looked at Alice, trying to understand what this meant. 2 negatives and 1 positive? How was that possible? I knew it. Falsifying test results is a crime. 2 of the clinics were ones I trust, Jimmy exclaimed. That's when Walter, visibly uncomfortable and with a fearful look, raised his hands in desperation. I need to confess something, he said, his voice low and ashamed. I'm not your real father, Alice. Alice's eyes widened in shock and confusion. What are you saying? Why did you make us go through all this? She asked, trying to process what she was hearing. Walter took a deep breath and continued, now looking directly at Alice. I lied. Your real biological father is Damien, an old business partner of mine. He was a dangerous man. Beatrice was involved with him in a complicated way, and he did a lot of terrible things. When I found out about you, I was afraid Damien would find you. So I decided to pretend to be your father to protect you. I wanted to keep you away from him. Alice was in shock. The revelations were too much to take in all at once. Damien, her real father, and Walter had pretended to be him to protect her. She felt a storm of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion. Why did you lie? Alice asked, her voice trembling. Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? Walter lowered his head, ashamed. I thought it was the best way to keep you safe. Damien is a cruel man. I didn't want him to have any chance of hurting you like he hurt your mother. But I was wrong to lie to you. I just wanted to protect you like Beatrice did. Jimmy stepped closer to Alice, placing a hand on her shoulder, trying to comfort her. He looked at Walter, a mix of anger and understanding in his eyes. You should have told the truth from the start. But now, we'll go after Damien and make sure he can't hurt anyone else. Alice, still in shock, took a deep breath and looked at Jimmy. She knew that despite everything, she wasn't alone. I just want the truth from now on, Alice said, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. Walter, visibly remorseful, nodded. I'll help. I'll tell you everything I know about Damien. Just please don't call the police. Jimmy knew that after everything they had discovered, he needed to tell Alice an important part of the past. A painful part, but one that might help her understand what Beatrice went through. He sat beside Alice, his face serious but full of empathy. Alice, there's something I've never told you about my separation from your mother, he began, his voice low. When Beatrice and I separated 25 years ago, it wasn't just a simple argument. It was much more complicated. Alice looked at him, both curious and worried. What happened? She asked, trying to understand what Jimmy was about to say. Jimmy took a deep breath, recalling the time he had tried to forget. Back then, Beatrice worked for a powerful man, her boss, Damien. One day I went to her office as a surprise to invite her to lunch. When I arrived, I saw her. I saw Damien as kissing Beatrice. And the worst part, she didn't resist. She didn't push him away. It was like she was used to it. I was in shock, not knowing what to think. Alice stayed silent, taking in every word. She had never imagined her mother might have gone through something like this. But why didn't she do anything? Weren't you married? Alice asked, trying to make sense of it. Jimmy shook his head, sadness in his eyes. At that moment I didn't understand either. Didn't. I thought she was cheating on me. that there was something between them. I was furious and we argued. That's when we separated. Alice felt a lump in her throat. And what happened to her after that? Alice asked, her voice trembling. Jimmy looked into her eyes. I decided to confront Damien. I went to his office ready to face the truth once and for all. Alice held her breath, waiting for the end of the story. But when he saw me coming, Damien went pale. He knew it was over. He didn't even wait for me to say a word. He just fled. He ran out the back door and disappeared, admitting to their affair. Alice was shocked by what she was hearing. Her mother's story was much darker and more painful than she had ever imagined. And you never saw her again? Alice asked. Jimmy shook his head. No, she vanished after that. I never wanted to know what happened to her again. It was too painful. The woman I loved with another man. Now, knowing Damien is your biological father. Jimmy paused, a sad look in his eyes. I think things make even more sense. Alice stayed silent for a moment, absorbing everything she had just heard. It was a lot to process, but she was finally beginning to understand why her mother had made so many difficult decisions. Thank you for telling me, Jimmy, Alice said, her voice low but firm. I needed to know. After all the revelations, Jimmy and Alice knew they couldn't keep the past buried any longer. Damien's actions needed to be exposed, and with Walter's help they decided to involve the police. Walter, who had shown remorse for lying, was ready to tell the whole truth. He knew he couldn't hide it anymore. The next morning, Jimmy and Alice went to the police station with Walter, where they gave their statements. They told the story of Beatrice, Damien's abandonment, and everything that had happened. The police chief listened carefully and quickly realized that this was more than just Alice's story. If what you're saying is true, Damien has a lot to explain. We need to find him and bring justice, and anyone involved must be held accountable, the chief said, looking at Walter seriously. Walter, visibly nervous, agreed. I swear I'll help. I should never have stayed silent for so long. I helped cover this up, Walter said, frightened and deeply afraid. Alice stood next to Jimmy in silence, processing every word Walter said. Are you ready to cooperate with the police? The chief asked Walter. Walter took a deep breath and responded, Yes, I am. I'll tell you everything I know. I just don't want to go to prison. Walter, looking at Jimmy and Alice with fear in his eyes, knew it was time to tell them everything he knew about Damien and the real story behind his relationship with Beatrice. Alice, visibly anxious, looked at him while Jimmy waited quietly, his expression firm. I know everything, Walter began, his voice heavy. I've been holding this in for a long time, but I think you both need to know what really happened, because I don't want to be associated with him or end up in jail. Alice and Jimmy exchanged glances, surprised by the seriousness in Walter's voice. Damien wasn't just any boss to your mother, Alice. He was a manipulator, someone who knew how to use his power to get what he wanted. He found out secrets from Beatrice's past and blackmailed her for years. That's how he kept her trapped, scared of losing everything, her ex-husband, and even you. Alice froze, feeling her heart tighten. But why didn't she ever tell me? Alice asked, her voice trembling. Walter sighed, as if carrying the weight of those memories. Beatrice wanted to protect you, Alice. Damien was a dangerous man, and she knew that if she fought him alone, the consequences would be terrible. He threatened not only to expose her past, but also to hurt the people she loved. She couldn't take that risk. So she stayed silent and endured the abuse, the blackmail, all to make sure that those she cared about stayed safe. Jimmy, who had been listening silently until now, clenched his fists in anger at the thought of what Beatrice had to endure. Why didn't anyone do anything? He asked, his voice tense. Someone should have stopped Damien before he destroyed so many lives. I thought she was betraying me. Walter lowered his head, clearly frustrated. Damien was clever. He always knew how to hide his actions. He surrounded himself with powerful people, and no one dared to challenge him. Beatrice tried once when she separated from you, Jimmy, but he threatened her again, and she backed down. She thought the only way to protect you was to stay away from you. at least until she found a way out. Alice felt tears welling up in her eyes, understanding for the first time the true sacrifice her mother had made. "She went through all that," Alice said, her voice breaking. Walter looked at Alice with sadness. "Walter, when she found out she was pregnant, she did everything she could to make sure Damien wouldn't hurt you. But now, finally, you can live without fear. Beatrice didn't abandon you by choice. She fought for you, right until the end, even if it was in silence." Alice wiped her tears and looked at Jimmy. The pieces were finally falling into place. With Walter's cooperation and his confession, the police were able to gather the necessary evidence to issue an arrest warrant for Damien. They discovered that he had been involved in various schemes over the years, always using his power to protect himself. But now, with Walter's revelations, his protective network was crumbling. The following week, the police finally tracked Damien down, hiding in a remote property. He tried to escape just as he had in the past, but this time he wasn't so lucky. He was arrested and taken to the police station, where he would face charges of abuse, blackmail, and manipulation. Walter was also arrested for being complicit in Damien's crimes, even though he was now helping the police. He knew he had to pay for what he had done. As Damien and Walter were led away by the police, Alice and Jimmy watched from a distance, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. "Finally, justice for my mother," Alice said, her voice filled with emotion. Jimmy, standing beside her, wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Beatrice can rest in peace now, Alice, and so can you. Her past won't haunt you anymore." Alice took a deep breath, knowing that although the journey had been difficult, she was finally beginning to find the peace she had been searching for. After everything that had happened, Alice felt that, despite the pain and difficult revelations, she needed to find a way to honor her mother's memory. Beatrice's struggle and sacrifices deserved something special. One evening, while she and Jimmy were talking about the future, Alice had an idea that made her smile for the first time in days. "You know, Jimmy, I've been thinking about something," Alice began, looking at him with a sparkle in her eyes. "I want to do something to honor my mother, something that celebrates who she was but also helps others. She suffered so much and never really had the chance for true peace. I think it's time to turn this story into something good." Curious, Jimmy leaned in a little closer, eager to hear what Alice had in mind. "What are you thinking?" he asked gently. Alice took a deep breath and smiled. "I want to open an ice cream shop, but not just any ice cream shop. I want it to be a place where people feel welcome, a place that reflects the kindness and generosity my mother had. I want to call it Beatrice's Secret." Jimmy sat silently for a moment, taking in the idea, then smiled back. "Beatrice's Secret. That's a beautiful name, Alice, and it's a wonderful idea. An ice cream shop that's not just about selling treats, but a place that carries her essence, who she was for you and so many others." Alice felt tears welling up in her eyes, but this time they were tears of happiness. "I want it to be a place where people find more than just something sweet. I want them to feel there's something special there, something made with love. My mum always thought of others, even during the hardest times, and I think she'd love to see something like this." Jimmy, touched by the idea, took Alice's hand and smiled with pride. "I'll help you with this, Alice. Whatever you need, we'll do it together. This will be the best tribute Beatrice could ever receive." Alice smiled, feeling a sense of relief in her heart. At last, she was finding a way to turn the pain of the past into something positive, something that would allow her mother to be remembered with love and respect. "Thank you, Jimmy. This means so much to me. It's the beginning of a new chapter. Not just for me, but for us." They stayed there talking about their plans, imagining how Beatrice's Secret could become a special place in the community, a place where people didn't just enjoy ice cream, but also felt the legacy of love and sacrifice that Beatrice had left behind. After Alice shared her idea of opening the ice cream shop to honor her mother, Jimmy was determined to help. He knew how much this project meant to Alice, and he wanted to do everything in his power to make it a reality. The next morning, as they had coffee together, Jimmy got straight to the point. "Alice, I've been thinking a lot about the ice cream shop and how important this is for you." He paused, looking at her with a gentle smile. I want you to know that I'll take care of all the expenses. I'll finance it from start to finish." Alice's eyes widened in surprise at what Jimmy had just said. "What? Jimmy, you don't need to do that," she replied, still trying to process his generosity. Jimmy, with a firm yet loving look, shook his head. "I know I don't have to, but I want to. This ice cream shop isn't just a project, Alice. It's a way to keep your mother's memory alive, to give something back to the community, and most importantly, to see you bring something from your heart to life. Leave it to me. I have the means, and nothing would make me happier than helping you make this happen. And I didn't tell you, but I spent the night crying, knowing that Beatrice was the love of my life and she went through all of that alone." Alice stayed silent for a moment, touched by his offer. She knew Jimmy cared about her, but she hadn't expected him to do something so big. "Jimmy, I don't even know how to thank you for this," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "You've already done so much for me, and now this. I'm not sure I deserve it." Jimmy gave her a warm smile, placing his hand over hers. "You deserve it, Alice. All of it. Your mother was an incredible person, and you've inherited her generous spirit. This ice cream shop isn't just a business. It's a tribute to Beatrice, and a way for you to leave your mark on the world. I'm just here to help you take the first step." Alice wiped away a tear that had stubbornly fallen and smiled, filled with gratitude. "I never imagined I'd have someone like you in my life, Jimmy. Thank you, really." "We're in this together," Jimmy replied, with conviction. And so, with Jimmy's support, Alice began turning her dream into reality. He handled every financial detail, from purchasing the land to overseeing the construction and stocking the shop. Alice, in turn, was involved in every decision with enthusiasm. She chose the suppliers, designed the decor, and even planned a special area in the shop for children, something that reflected Beatrice's generous spirit. Their partnership wasn't just about money or business, it was about love, respect, and creating something that brought peace to both of them. Alice couldn't have been more grateful to have Jimmy by her side on this journey. The day of the ice cream shop's grand opening had finally arrived. Beatrice's secret was ready to open its doors, and the local community had already gathered outside, eager to see the space that Alice and Jimmy had built with so much care. The shop was beautiful and welcoming, with large glass windows letting in natural light, giving it a simple and peaceful atmosphere, just as Alice had envisioned. As Alice chatted with some of the people attending, Jimmy stood a little further back, watching everything around him. He was proud, but also deeply emotional. To him, this moment meant more than just opening an ice cream shop. It symbolized everything he and Alice had been through together, and most of all, it was a tribute to the woman who had changed both their lives, Beatrice. Jimmy looked up at the sign with the name Beatrice's Secret, and for a moment, he felt his heart tighten. Beatrice had always had a special way of touching people's lives, even in the hardest times. Despite everything she had been through, her legacy of love and generosity lived on, now reflected in this ice cream shop. It wasn't just a place for buying treats, it was a space of care for the community. He remembered the Beatrice from years ago, the woman who always did everything for those she loved, showing strength even in the darkest moments. Now, looking at Alice, he saw that same strength. Alice had inherited that generosity, that deep care for others. And Jimmy knew that Beatrice would be proud of the daughter she had raised, even though she had never been able to share the whole truth. As customers began entering the shop, Jimmy reflected on how much his life had changed. He had gone from being a lonely man, living in the past and his memories, to someone who was now part of something bigger, part of a new family. Alice approached, smiling. "What are you doing here all by yourself?" she asked, with a sparkle in her eyes. Jimmy smiled back, placing a caring hand on her shoulder. "I was just thinking how proud Beatrice would be of you. All of this, it's exactly what she would have done." Alice lowered her head for a moment, touched by his words. "I just wish she could be here to see it all," Alice said, her voice heavy with emotion. Jimmy hugged her, understanding the weight of the moment. She is here, Alice, in all of this, and now you're carrying forward what she always wanted, to care for others. Alice smiled, still emotional, and nestled into Jimmy's embrace. They stayed there for a moment in silence, sharing the peace they had finally found. As people continued to enter, and the shop came to life, Jimmy looked at Alice, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. They had turned pain into something beautiful, and most importantly, they had found a new family along the way. With Beatrice's secret up and running, and the community growing more involved in the project, Alice and Jimmy began to find something that had once seemed impossible: peace. The daily work, the kindness of the customers, and the feeling of doing something special together brought a new energy into their lives. Slowly, the pain of the past gave way to a sense of renewal. One afternoon, after another day of work, Alice and Jimmy sat in the small cafe area they had set up inside the ice cream shop. It was a simple but cozy spot where they often sat at the end of the day, watching the people come and go. "Can you believe how much our lives have changed in such a short time?" Alice asked, looking at Jimmy with a peaceful smile. Jimmy glanced around, watching the activity in the shop, the families coming in, the children running around. It was hard to believe that this man, once surrounded by loneliness and sadness, was now part of something so beautiful. He smiled at Alice, feeling a deep sense of pride in her. "It's amazing, isn't it?" he said with a satisfied tone. "I couldn't be prouder of you. All of this, Alice, is because of your strength, your desire to make things better, and seeing how you've embraced the past. It's inspiring." Alice looked at Jimmy, her eyes shining with emotion. She knew that without him, none of this would have happened. "I couldn't have done it without you, Jimmy. You're the one who helped me move forward, to find the answers, and most of all, to see that the past can teach us, but it doesn't have to hold us back." Jimmy, touched by her words, smiled back, smiled. "We've both learned that, Alice, and now what matters is that we're here together. We're not just two people surviving pain, we're a family." Alice felt her heart warm at those words. For so many years, she had felt alone, carrying doubts about who she was and where she came from. But now she had Jimmy by her side. "Family," Alice said, repeating the word with love. "I never thought I'd be able to say that with such certainty, but now I know. We are a family." Jimmy held her hand tightly, feeling that somehow everything had fallen into place. Beatrice's past, full of secrets and pain, had been revealed, and with that came healing. And the future. It was full of possibilities, built on the love and trust they had shared throughout this journey. "We're just getting started, Alice," Jimmy said with a hopeful smile. "And this time nothing will stop us," Alice replied, smiling back. "So what would you do in Alice's place? What do you think of Beatrice's courage, keeping secrets and sacrificing her own life to protect those she loved? Do you think you'd have the bravery to seek out so many answers about the past, even knowing they could change your life forever? Share in the comments how you'd handle. Share in a situation like this. And if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more moving stories like this one. And hey, there's another incredible video popping up on the screen right now. Click on it and keep watching, because the next story will surprise you too.